morning, everyone. As most of you know, I'm Terry Flynn. I am the graduate director of the MCM program, and I will be the chair of today's defense. Today we have Cassia defending her capstone. Title is The Impact of Promotional Guidelines on Cannabis Education and Communication in Canada. Her supervisor is Professor Dave Scholz, and her second reader is Professor Mark Stewart. Cassia will have 25 minutes to present her findings from her research, and then starting with Professor Schultz, we'll start a series of questions that will last about 25 minutes, and then the three of us will then meet to discuss her presentation and her future in the MCM alumni community. Okay, so without further ado, you have 25 minutes. You'll go to about 10:26, but take your time. This is an important opportunity, and just relax. So you're on the clock.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to listen to my defense today on the impact of promotional guidelines on cannabis education and communication in Canada. So as most of you've known, I've been working in the cannabis industry since before legalization and have had the opportunity to see the legal industry develop throughout the last 6 years. With this experience, I've navigated Health Canada's regulations across a few cannabis companies and have seen how the regulations are enforced to varying degrees and how cannabis companies adapt to complying within the regulatory framework to educate consumers about their products. So this framework was designed to prioritize public safety, prohibiting cannabis brands from communicating and using lifestyle advertising and testimonials with many restrictions on promotional tactics and where those tactics can take place. While these regulations aim to protect consumers, they also create barriers to effective communication, which brought me to my research of examining the challenges of the cannabis industry's promotional restrictions, comparing them to the alcohol industry, and understanding that impact on public access to education. But before I get into all of that, my research began with providing context of the current consumer perception and the state of the current industry. Throughout the last 6 years of legalization, we've seen the cannabis industry progress throughout the various stages of the industry life cycle. In 2018, legalization marked the introduction stage of the life cycle, where the market launched rapidly and created significant initial growth. During this stage, Health Canada's reports noted that 22% of Canadians were consuming cannabis and only 7% viewed regular use as harmful. From 2019 to 2022, over the next few years, the industry revenue steadily grew and consumer behavior shifted towards legal purchases. Cannabis consumption also saw a slight increase, with 27% of Canadians reporting use. So throughout 2023 and projected onwards, although revenue is steadily growing, the growth rate has declined significantly, suggesting market saturation and the onset of the shakeout phase of the industry life cycle, which is seen with increased competition from cannabis brands and retailers. So with this came a few challenges, the first being the continued stigma. Despite these shifts with increased usage, stigma surrounding cannabis use persists. Research shows that recreational users, users who use through inhalation, frequent consumers, and those purchasing from unregulated sources still face the most stigma. The second challenge is the illicit market. High compliance cost and taxation make it difficult for legal cannabis businesses to compete with the illicit market, which, according to reports from sources like Deloitte, continue to thrive even in 2025. The last challenge being indirect incentives. With a heavily saturated and saturated industry and a lack of ability to differentiate in the market, more and more cannabis companies use indirect incentives like paying for shelf space and bud tender contesting, which is illegal within the regulatory framework, but it's disguised with data deals. This leads to biased recommendations from retailers and bud tenders and negatively affects consumer trust. And this can be seen throughout many Reddit forums like the ROCS, where consumers and bud tenders are talking about how they're forced to push product or feel like they're forced product on them when stepping into retail locations. So to better understand how to navigate a regulated market, I examined my literature review within the constraints of a regulated industry. First, I looked at the impact of policy on communication strategies. Regulating the cannabis industry is essential for public safety and informed decision-making. However, rigid regulations can distort markets, especially in emerging industries. Studies show the need for flexible, adaptable policies, but enforcements remain inconsistent across Canada, which leads to fragmented messaging and regulatory uncertainty, which leads to my second research in my lit review, regulatory ambiguity. Cannabis companies operate in an environment where compliance rules are vague, open to interpretation, and inconsistently enforced. Health Canada's promotional restrictions lack clear guidelines, making it difficult for brands to know what is permitted. Research shows that 86% of licensed producers with an online presence have unknowingly violated Health Canada's Cannabis Act. This uncertainty forces companies to choose between playing it safe and limiting their engagement or pushing regulatory boundaries to compete in a saturated market. I also looked at ethical marketing and consumer autonomy. Marketing significantly influences consumer behaviors, making ethical responsibility critical in a regulated industry like cannabis. Recognizing ethical issues helps marketers prevent harm and maintain consumer autonomy. Alcohol marketing research shows that media literacy can help consumers identify persuasive tactics and make better choices, which can illustrate how restrictive cannabis regulations may limit access to crucial information, leaving consumers reliant on social norms from peers or bud tenders rather than objective resources. I also looked at brand reputation. So, building a strong brand reputation relies on trust, transparency, and consistency, but the strict marketing regulations challenge this in cannabis. Unlike alcohol brands using lifestyle ads to build trust, cannabis companies contend with social media bans and advertising limits. In a crowded market that has grown 369% since 2020, with the top 12% of brands now dominating 80% of sales, establishing a reputation is increasingly difficult. I also looked at stakeholder relationships in a regulated industry, since balancing relationships with primary stakeholders such as retailers and secondary stakeholders, including regulators, is essential for building trust. Proactively engaging with regulators can mitigate risks and strengthen trust, even in a highly regulated environment. So, the relationship between cannabis companies and regulators like Health Canada or provincial boards is defined by legality relationships, which emphasize strict compliance. Positive signals from regulators like regulatory relief create trust, but negative signals such as enforcement actions ensure adherence but can also restrict flexibility and innovation. Lastly, I looked at lessons from tobacco and alcohol industries. Both these industries highlight the risk of self regulation and the need for transparent public communication. The tobacco industry's history shows how misleading marketing tactics can ruin public trust, while the alcohol industry benefits from fewer restrictions, allowing brands to communicate directly with consumers and build trust through engagement. Cannabis companies can use these insights to prevent the same mistakes seen in tobacco marketing and grow their audience trust. So, this led to my research thesis where I explored how and to what extent promotional strategies in the Canadian cannabis industry have been impacted by Health Canada's regulatory guidelines in providing effective educational communication to the public. I explored four research questions, the first being how media strategies evolved in the Canadian cannabis industry since legalization. The second explored how cannabis companies face challenges complying with Health Canada's guidelines. My third research question looked at how cannabis companies are impacted by Health Canada's regulatory guidelines on their ability to communicate to the public. And lastly, I looked how cannabis companies communicate with educational information to different stakeholder groups like the public, retailers, and government bodies underneath these guidelines. For my research, I used a mixed method approach combining qualitative and quantitative data with a literature review. This triangulation helped validate findings and provided deeper insights into regulatory impacts. First, the literature review established the background on regulatory guidelines and their influence on cannabis education, brand trust, and reputation. Next, a content analysis compared the marketing strategies of cannabis and alcohol brands. I analyzed 100 promotional materials from online press releases and blog articles, 50 from each industry. I identified communication differences shaped by regulations. These materials were coded with key variables, including different types of marketing tactics used, messaging type, whether it was educational or promotional, target audience like public, retailers, or government, and whether these tactics were age gated. Lastly, to complement this, I conducted 13 in-depth interviews with marketing leaders, advocates, policymakers, and regulators in the Canadian cannabis industry. These one-hour interviews explored industry challenges, compliance strategies, and opportunities for improving public education within Health Canada's guidelines. Leading into my results in research question one, since the legalization of recreational cannabis, media strategies in the industry have dramatically evolved in Canada. with pre-legalization allowed cannabis brands like Aurora and Tweed to freely use high visibility tactics like concerts, celebrity endorsements, billboards, and digital campaigns to establish their brand and engage consumers directly. These bold lifestyle focused efforts were designed to normalize cannabis and created a strong brand association, which now made them one of the most known brands in the current industry. This period was oftenly referred to as the Wild West of cannabis marketing. So, post legalization, the Cannabis Act imposed strict regulations, drastically limiting traditional advertising channels. As a result, cannabis companies shifted to compliant strategies, emphasizing digital media, in store promotions, and indirect consumer education. The initial period saw brands becoming risk averse, mainly engaging retailers and bud tenders rather than consumers directly. So, we can see this on my content analysis in my chart, where digital advertising and social media and in store advertising are the main forms of communication in cannabis. We also noted that 83% of cannabis tactics were age gated, while only 16% of alcohol tactics were age gated. So, in contrast, alcohol brands have more flexibility in traditional advertising, influencer collaboration, resulting in stronger visibility and a broader promotional tactics that hit multiple channels, such as sponsorships, events, and out of home advertising. So, they're able to spread their communications across multiple tactics, reaching a wider audience. Research question 2 results identified 4 areas that provided barriers for brands to communicate with the public to educate them about their products. The first being regulatory ambiguity. These challenges stem from ambiguous Health Canada regulations, which lead to inconsistent interpretation and enforcement. Industry professionals noted the broad and vague nature of these guidelines, aimed at covering diverse scenarios, but also created uncertainty. Varying definitions of regulatory terms across different government levels further complicated compliance. Additionally, unclear rules on acceptable promotional content created obstacles, with regulations aiming for fairness but often resulting in uneven enforcement. This also heightens financial pressures, with smaller companies particularly vulnerable to regulatory risks since they can't jeopardize their operations. As a result, many companies focus on B2B communications, but in the cannabis industry, this is seen as brand to bud tender. And this is so they can comply with the regulations rather than using consumer facing promotions. Another key barrier to effective cannabis education is difficulty in providing accurate information due to Health Canada's restrictions on health claims and the promotion of non-THC components. These limitations often lead to misleading or oversimplified claims, which can result in misinformation being passed to consumers, especially through bud tenders, as this creates a communication gap between suppliers and retailers, which affects the accuracy of information relayed to consumers. Additionally, not all bud tenders have the necessary education to provide information, creating an atmosphere of distrust and leading to fragmented messaging. The third barrier faced by cannabis companies is the packaging and product guidelines set by Health Canada. While these regulations aim to ensure public safety, they complicate the ability to provide clear educational information. Many of the industry professionals pointed out that the lack of simplified consumer-friendly messaging on packaging makes it difficult for users to understand product contents and effects. Some suggested using a universal language like pharmaceutical products to improve clarity. Additionally, current packaging rules have led to THC inflation, where companies focusing on maximizing THC content to attract consumers, often misleading them to thinking higher THC equals better quality, while overshadowing other important factors like terpene and cannabinoid profiles and product experience. A final barrier identified is the disparity in regulatory leniency between alcohol and cannabis marketing. Alcohol companies face fewer restrictions, allowing them to focus on promotional content, while cannabis companies are heavily focused on educational content due to stricter regulations. Cannabis companies produced more educational content, around 19 pieces in my content analysis, where alcohol, all of them were promotional. The industry professionals pointed out that alcohol companies have more freedom in their advertising, often using lifestyle-based campaigns, while cannabis brands are restricted in their marketing tactics, creating a barrier in building brand awareness and consumer engagement and trust. Health Canada's regulatory framework has significantly impacted how cannabis companies can communicate with the public, limiting their ability to build brand awareness, educate consumers, and promote products. These regulations created 3 main challenges, which presented in my research question 3. First being communication barriers with consumers. Health Canada's guidelines limit cannabis companies' ability to engage directly with consumers, so brands are unable to address consumer concerns or provide detailed product information. As industry professionals pointed out, without clear and accessible product information, new consumers often rely on THC percentage, limiting their understanding. Additionally, unlike the alcohol industry, cannabis companies cannot offer product samples or engage consumers directly. Social media communications is also heavily restricted, requiring brands to speak in code to comply with regulations, which further creates misunderstanding with consumers. Another challenge was product promotion limitations. So, promotional messaging is allowed only within cannabis retail stores, which limits exposures to consumers who have already expressed interest, leading to cannabis companies speaking to the same audience over and over again. Also, Health Canada prohibits brands from highlighting product benefits such as relaxation or creativity, further hindering effective communication. This restriction limits cannabis companies' ability to build a brand identity, forcing them to rely on loopholes to reach consumers, which further perpetuates the stigma. Lastly, is competing with the illicit market. One unintended consequence of these restrictions is that they benefit the illicit market. The whole purpose to legalizing cannabis was to eradicate this market. But by limiting legal cannabis companies' ability to communicate with consumers and educate them on the safety and quality of regulated products, these restrictions push consumers towards unregulated sources and sometimes unknowingly purchasing from unregulated sources. The illicit market thrives as a result, with consumers turning to illegal channels for cannabis information and products. This creates a significant challenge for legal cannabis companies trying to compete and build consumer trust. Moving into my last research question, I explored how cannabis companies communicate to different stakeholders. First, public communications is very strong on both tactics of cannabis and alcohol, but cannabis brands really rely heavily on social media and digital advertising to reach the public, which is seen here in the dark purple bars. Public communication is often indirect, with brands communicating through retailers and social media, and influencers also play a key role in education. So we can see that here. Whereas retailer communications is more so in-store advertising and bud tender training, that is central to cannabis brand strategy, which is seen in the light purple bars over here. So a bud tender's knowledge and motivation also impacts the accuracy of information provided to consumers, and this gap further perpetuates the understanding down to consumers. Lastly, we have communications with government, which is very limited and non-existent in alcohol. And these are primarily focused on compliance rather than education. And when we look at tactics used for alcohol audiences, they are spread among more tactics that are public facing and definitely only for public as well. So most promotional tactics are used directly to the public, with minimal tactics used for retailers as well, and none for government. So, leading into my discussion, I focused on key challenges, strategies, and proposed regulatory changes in the cannabis industry. One of the primary challenges is regulatory ambiguity. As mentioned earlier, this uncertainty creates difficulty for both industry professionals and policymakers. And a strategic approach to addressing these issues is leveraging regulatory impact assessments, or RIAs, to evaluate cannabis regulations. RIAs provide a structured framework to assess how cannabis regulations influence public education, industry sustainability, and harm reduction strategies. This approach could be beneficial both internally, helping companies navigate compliance, and externally, guiding Health Canada in refining regulatory guidelines. By integrating RIAs into policy discussions, we can create a more transparent and evidence-based regulatory framework. Another challenge is the heavily reliance on bud tenders for consumer education. While bud tenders play an important role, their knowledge levels and biases can vary, which impacts how consumers receive that information. A key strategy to address this issue is direct to consumer education. I recognize that the regulations aim to limit the glamorization of cannabis, but this doesn't mean we can't have ethical, transparent marketing. One way to achieve this balance is by using the consumer sovereignty test and integrating that into the regulations when talking to consumers directly. This test assesses whether marketing strategies support informed, independent decision making rather than persuasive marketing tactics. By integrating this into cannabis regulations, we can allow for promotional activities that educate consumers without encouraging irresponsible use. This would create a more balanced and transparent marketing approach, ensuring consumers receive accurate, unbiased product information. The next challenge is packaging and labeling restrictions, which have been a major limitation for consumer education. However, as of March 13th, updates have actually been introduced, and many of the changes introduced were brought up within my interviews. So these changes include simplified languages on packaging, making it easier for consumers to understand product details. And this is a significant step forward as it allows for more educational content on packaging while maintaining compliance with regulatory guidelines. Finally, there's the ongoing disparity between cannabis and alcohol marketing regulations. While alcohol brands can freely advertise lifestyle benefits, cannabis remains heavily restricted. A proposed regulatory change is the introduction of controlled lifestyle marketing and also allowing cannabis brands to share testimonials about product. This does not mean glamorizing cannabis use. Instead, using frameworks like the mindful consumption and benefit maximization framework can be implemented within the regulations. Unlike traditional harm reduction approaches that are usually taken when talking about cannabis, these frameworks highlight the mindful use of cannabis rather than the harmful use of cannabis. It also talks about its benefits and the variety of consumption methods available. By adopting controlled lifestyle marketing within regulatory boundaries, brands could engage directly with consumers and help promote responsible and informed consumption rather than perpetuating stigma. Although I would love to see further reform within promotional regulations, the cannabis industry must continue to navigate the existing guidelines effectively. So here are some avenues that offer successful outcomes within the restrictions. This involves aligning all promotional efforts strictly within compliance boundaries. Companies can achieve this by maximizing in-store education through strategic retail displays, detailed product information, and significant investment in bud tender training. Putting traditional resources into retail spaces is critical as it directly influences consumers' decisions at the point of sale. Beyond traditional social media as well, you can leverage digital channels with age gating. So cannabis companies should explore other digital platforms like Reddit or cannabis-focused blogs like StratCan. These age-gated networks enable targeted marketing and promotions to relevant adult audiences. However, the drawback here is that these platforms often engage the same consumers, already informed cannabis community, which limits broader outreach and education. So you can also encourage user-generated content, and this will help build that community outside of your same echo chamber. And consumers and influencers can organically discuss or showcase product and create credibility and genuine interest. But relying heavily on UGC means promotions are less predictable as they depend on voluntary participation and influencer willingness, making results uncertainty. So lastly, partnerships with educational or resource organizations can offer opportunities to engage a broader audience. These collaborations, although requiring substantial investment, can contribute to education and reducing stigma and reach an audience outside of the audience you are normally talking to. So with that, my research did come with a few limitations, the first being subjective biases and also research bias, as everyone I interviewed and myself as well included all work within the industry. I also had a small sample size, only 13 of 40 individuals agreed to participate. Time constraint was a huge factor as well, as it led to a lack of a second coder, as this was a very specialized field, understanding the difference between alcohol tactics and cannabis tactics, so I did not have the time to train a second coder for this. And as I noted, the evolving regulatory landscape. So March 13th, the day I handed in my paper, there were changes to the regulations as well. And lastly, this is a very new industry. So as the industry grows, the need for more future research can see how it changes the landscape. And that future research can look at stakeholder collaborations and policy development and how involving different stakeholders can develop more better policies. Taking this research and directing it towards bud tenders as a focus, where I can learn, or we can learn how bud tenders communicate to consumers as well. Also, understanding the different regional regulatory differences between provinces is needed for future research, or ways of educating consumers. So finding innovative ways to educate consumers and about the effects as well, and seeing that long-term change affect behavioral studies with consumers and understanding education towards cannabis. So that concludes my research, but a big thank you to Dave, my advisor, and your patience and guidance throughout this research was really amazing, and I could not have completed this without you. I also want to say a big thank you to my MCM fam. We are the best cohort, and I'm so privileged to have learned alongside each and every one of you. And of course, thank you to all of the professors, Terry, Mark, my second reader, and every other professor I had the privilege of learning from for the last 2.5 years. It's been an honor. And thank you to my friends and family for the patience and encouragement as I finalize this master's. So with that, I hesitantly ask you to ask any questions.
No, do it without hesitation and perfectly on 25 minutes. Well done, Cassia. Thank you very much. Very interesting and timely capstone research as well. So congratulations on making it through the presentation. So, Professor Scholz, you're the first up.
Thank you, Dr. Flynn. Cassia, that was great work. Thank you for putting that together. Well done. Although it looks like you forgot to thank the cats who were also in your picture. So I hope they're not feeling slighted by that. So I'm going to go back to March 13th.
Yes.
And you talked briefly that some of the regulatory changes had been what your research had shown. Can you go into a little bit more depth on that? Like what changed, and is this what your research was showing, or is there changes that you were surprised by?
So I was very surprised. Like this conversation has been in the works for the last 2 years, with Health Canada releasing a What We Heard report, kind of engaging stakeholders and understanding what has been missing. So some of the changes that were taking place for promotionals or marketing strictly was just directed towards packaging. So they created some of the changes have been simplified THC and cannabis components on the packaging, so it allows consumers to read that a lot easier. Removal of a lot of different unnecessary things that have been on the packaging that wasn't there, so it allows for more brand space, or space for cannabis companies to talk about different product benefits on the packaging. Flower packaging also now allows like a little window, so you can look at the product and see the product prior to purchase, which is really awesome. And then they also simplified the health warnings as well, and they made them different based off of categories. So they were universal across different categories like flour and oil and edibles. And sometimes the health warnings did not make sense to what the product was. So they changed that and also simplified the language, so it makes it easier to understand the potential harm from cannabis usage. And lastly, which has been like my favorite change, was allowing inserts in packaging. So a lot of the times, something that we currently are facing at my company is we produced a new product innovation where it's a completely new consumption method where you put it between your lip and your cheek. And it's very new. So a lot of consumers were using the product wrong, even though we had usage instructions on the back. But because the instructions are very medical looking and boring, people tend to rip open the package and throw it out, and have been using the product wrong completely. So now we can insert promotional materials inside that packaging and make it a little bit more friendly and like lifestyle driven, where consumers can relate to it and actually read how to use the product. So that one's my definitely favorite change within the packaging, is being able to provide that more education to consumers that way.
So yeah, THC content is also something that stands out for me. And in your paper, you talk about how without a lack of consumer education a lot of decisions are made based on the percentage of THC. And I don't go into an LCBO and make a decision on what I'm going to buy based on the alcohol content level. At least maybe I did when I was younger, but not at this age. Do you see that? Because to me, that would be a huge shift. What would have to happen for you to be able to better educate people on reasons why you buy outside of THC content?
Yeah, being able to actually talk about the benefits of product or what cannabis can do for you. So it's very limited, as like it's restricted, similar to, I guess, advertising about medical. Like, so they think, making a claim that cannabis can help you sleep, or cannabis, this portion of cannabis can help you be a mood elevator. We can't say those things about product. So for instance, if there is CBG associated outside of THC inside of cannabis, like that's a mood elevator. And we can't talk about that to people. We can't tell people like this is what it could potentially affect you with. So we're just forced by saying, hey, this is the highest percentage of THC, because that's all what people know about. So being able to educate the public about different cannabinoids, different terpene profiles that actually affect how you feel when consuming cannabis, it would be really beneficial, but we're very limited on that. And we're technically not allowed to say that. We have to kind of say it through a code, essentially. So, sativa, people think, oh, it's an upper, so you'll be more energetic, but in reality, that's not the case. So it's the terpenes and the cannabinoids that actually affect the differences in cannabis for you and how it makes you feel. So if we can be able to talk about those through like the benefits, and also, maximizing that education, will definitely help consumers move away from just focusing on high THC content and move towards like other benefits that cannabis actually provide, and not always moving towards like inhalation, because obviously that's the most harmful use of cannabis use. But being able to talk about extracting different types of cannabinoids through other processes in edibles and oils, which are safer consumption methods as well. So that would be the best way to help educate consumers, aside from just understanding the THC components about the product.
Okay, thanks, Cassia.
Thank you for those
Thank you,
questions.
Professor Schultz, for those first two very interesting questions. I was thinking about Brodeur beer from Quebec, maybe had more alcohol than regular Ontario-based beer, but no, I digress. So, Professor Stewart.
Thanks. And yeah, I'm glad you decided to tackle this topic, Cassie. You know, I've had a kind of few loose conversations over the past couple of years about the fact that the federal government's decided, to open up this space, and at the same time has put in place a regulatory framework, which we presume is trying to balance, driving a new economy, consumer safety, this whole variety of factors, right? And maybe has landed up somewhere in a little bit of a mushy middle with it all, right? And it's perhaps not so clear. If I was to ask the regulators, what is your thesis on what you would like to see with, where Canada is at with cannabis, what that actually is? So a couple of questions. What advice would you give to others in the industry about how you can try to influence the regulators to move towards some of the recommendations or ongoing reform about the constraints that are placed on the industry?
Well, I think like this was the whole purpose to my research. Like none of the, I guess, findings were kind of new to me. Like I knew that this was going to be the common research that, like, when talking to people within my interviews and talking or looking within the content analysis, like I knew that these were the major problems. So the whole point was to kind of present these findings and let regulators know, like, this is where our limitation is, and because of this, you are perpetuating more people to be pushed to the illicit market versus purchasing from legal cannabis sources. So really providing them this information and understanding that, like, limiting connection to consumers is going to actually, like, put a little bit more harm on the cannabis industry as well, and create that, like, stigma that it is harmful, or the only way to consume is through inhalation methods. So using my goal, hopefully after all of this, and I'm not tired anymore and have a little bit more energy, is to kind of like go to companies like the C3, which are boards that help push for policy reform, and they really push towards packaging updates. So this is another thing that they can kind of move towards as well, is kind of pushing towards reform on promotional activities to help regulators understand that talking to consumers is actually beneficial, but there are ways that you can talk to consumers that still don't glamorize cannabis use, and we don't go to the full way that alcohol is for advertising. Like, I'm not suggesting that we take full on marketing approaches like alcohol, because I do think there needs to be a little bit more restrictions there, because they do glamorize use quite a bit. But talking and showing how the benefits of talking to consumers through other regulations that can make sure that these communications are, regulated in a source that we aren't perpetuating more of a persuasive conversation, but providing them education to make their own discerned choices, rather than, stepping into a retail store. Like, when I walk into the LCBO, the cashiers aren't coming up to me and telling me what to purchase, or this is better than this. But when you walk into, a dispensary, that's exactly what they're doing. And you can't really rely on a bud tender who is like 21 years old to know any of about over maybe 2,000 SKUs that are in the market, and how that's going to affect someone else's lifestyle as well. So, cannabis affects everyone very differently. And I think that that's like a personal journey that you need to kind of educate yourself on. And to do that is to being able to directly communicate. So pushing regulators towards understanding this type of research, and understanding that there still is reform that we can use, or regulations when talking to consumers, but allowing that to happen now rather than blocking that. I hope that answered your.
You did, and yeah, well stated. And I'm glad, you're adding a data-driven voice to this, because one of the challenges is going to be convincing, regulators on how to evolve this. And obviously, we're going to have a new federal regime one way or another in the not too far future. I think at this point, we're probably not clear about what their perspective might be on cannabis from either of the leading parties, but really interesting timing to bring it out there. One thing that's a little bit outside the scope of your paper, but I was wondering about, and it also relates to making the case, is what's happened in Canada is somewhat concurrent to cannabis opening up in some other different jurisdictions as well.
Yeah.
And, are there lessons, case studies, data, insights that are coming out where there are different regulatory regimes, and, we're seeing different ways that those are playing out, and those might provide evidence or weight to changes in Canada?
Yeah, so I've had the privilege to work with US-based companies as well. So we've seen the difference between how it's regulated within particular states that are legalized. It is a lot more lenient, especially when it comes to packaging reform, and they don't really rely on high THC components. So what I've noticed is that, like, you can put out a 22% THC product in America and you're not going to get like booed on by consumers, whereas in Canada, like, they're looking for 35%, which is literally impossible. So seeing that kind of from the American side of stuff is like, well, they're not pushing towards just THC because their packaging promotes other products, and they're actually allowed to talk to consumers directly through advertising. They have billboards, they have like seed to sale as well. So it's not through government provincial. So they grow the product and then they sell the product at their own retail level. So they have more of that connection to consumers as well. And I think that's kind of something that would kind of show how, being able to talk to consumers this way will help perpetuate that THC percentage isn't the only thing about cannabis. And then because of that, and like they're allowed to use a little bit more of lifestyle driven content as well, people can connect to brands that fit their lifestyle a little bit better, rather than like picking and choosing random elements and hoping to see if this is the product for them, and spending more money in reality in retail. But I guess that's kind of what the government wants anyways. But yeah, so just like looking from the US at this point is, having a little bit more leniency in different states. I've particularly only worked with Michigan, but because of that leniency, they don't rely heavily on high THC.
Interesting. Thank you.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Cassie. Very, very interesting um, study. You obviously have demonstrated a huge market understanding and the complexities of it, and you've been through this right from the start of it. So your perspective is very, very mature, but also very probably well sought after. I mean, you have the ability to really kind of stand at a higher level to look at these different things. And yet, you talk about the different regulated products like the LCBO. And of course, the province here in Ontario decided differently to not
Mhm.
take the same kind of route and commercialize it or privatize it. Do you think if the province had done an LCBO or adjuncted to LCBO, some of these issues would be different than how you see it today?
Um, well, the Quebec market took that approach, so you can only purchase through SQDC. And it's actually caused a lot more limitation because, like, even as an LP or a brand, we're not allowed to communicate to anyone in Quebec at all, even bud tenders. That's fully illegal. And I feel like that creates a gap of even more education as they just rely on like sativa indica information, and it limits them, and they still have like a really, really high illicit market that is thriving in Quebec, especially because they have a lot more limitations there. So unfortunately, like it wasn't actually a better approach, where BC took the approach of both ways. So like there's private retail and then there's also government owned retail. And I think that has helped a lot more because it talks to different types of consumers. As you know, there's, legacy consumers who go back into the day from like pre-legalization and want kind of that familiarity of how that cannabis is being purchased and whatever. So they go to these types of dispensaries, whereas maybe if you're new to cannabis, you want more of an educational approach, you'd go to BC, but or the BC cannabis store, which is more government like related as well. So personally, I think the BC province has set up the way like the dispensaries the best because it's a kind of the best of both worlds. And they've kind of set regulations where there's not an oversaturation of retail stores as well, like in Toronto or Ontario specifically. So I feel like consumers kind of have more options to choose different types of retailers depending on their level of knowledge and kind of what fits their lifestyle of like purchasing cannabis as well. So that approach has kind of gone both ways. Um, so it really, I guess, depends. But yeah, I don't think going just the LCBO route is 100% great unless we remove restrictions from promotional activities. So if the restrictions are still there and we go the LCBO route, like consumers are going to have like no education at all. So I think it's going to cause a little bit more difficulty. But if they open up the communications to consumers directly, I think that route would be beneficial because then they become more so a cashier, and people walking into these stores are making their own discerned decisions on product rather than being influenced by bud tenders as well. So I think it'll
Right.
it'll be beneficial if the regulations loosen up.
So, what are you going to do with this? How are
Well,
you going to mobilize this? How are you going to share this with not just the community, but obviously there's a lot of education within the academia, in terms of marketing and communications of regulated products like this. What are you going to do?
yeah, well, taking some of the research from like my literature review will be very useful, like internally at my current job. So using it that way, but also hopefully getting on boards like C3 as well to push for more reform, and hopefully joining kind of boards that way so I can push that research towards regulators and Health Canada so they can start understanding the benefits of kind of relieving some of that restriction on guidelines. So that's how I hope to use it moving forward, and then seeing if there's any other types of educational conferences that I can potentially present this at as well. And potentially connecting with some of the interviewees that I had the privilege of working with. A lot of them are policymakers in the industry as well, and have created a lot of awesome research that I used within my paper, and connecting with them and how we can take that research and push it towards more of a promotional strategy as well, like the maximize benefit consumption method that I talked about, using that and implementing that within promotional guidelines and creating that within those promotions.
That's great. Thank you. Dave and Mark, one final question.
Oh, you're on mute.
I don't have a final question, but I have a final comment. Prior to this paper, if you had told me I would enjoy reading anything to do with the word regulatory communications in it, I would have said you were crazy. But this was truly an eye-opening, knowledge-building experience for me. So thank you, Cassia.
Thank you for all your support. I appreciate it.
Right. Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, well said, Dave. I just want to echo that, I'm pleased you are deciding to tackle this. In Canada these days, we have a lot on our minds, but nonetheless, I think there remains a lot of opportunity to lead here. And I think you've positioned yourself well, through this project, through the MCM and your activity in the space to continue to advocate for this being as constructive as possible. So well done.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
So I'm going to open it up to the gallery, MCM 16, family, guests. Anybody else want to ask the Cassia Butterista? I'm going to invent that new name. Not like bud tender. That sounds like a Butterista.
Okay, I
That's
like
who you're going to ask, right?
that.
Anybody have any questions to ask this expert Butterista?
I'll take the title.
Okay, seeing none, I'm going to put everybody in the in a waiting room or a breakout room so you can have a chat. Congratulate Cassia on a job well done. And Mark and Dave and I will come back. So for those that are new to this, please accept the invitation to join the room, and then we'll close the room when we are ready to bring everybody back.